Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we will be analysing the character of Bob Cratchit, the downtrodden clerk in Charles Dickens' classic tale A Christmas Carol. Bob works for Ebenezer Scrooge, the protagonist of the story, and is subjected to horrendous working conditions and an unfairly low salary with which he does his best to support a huge family and dying son. Despite these awful circumstances, however, Bob is able to keep his over-the-top Christmas spirit and never complains or slanders Scrooge for the situation he is in. Because of this, he can come off as kind of absurd or unrealistic, so in this video, we will look at whether or not Bob is a fully realized character. We will also discuss why his character was important at the time Dickens wrote this novella, and see how relatable he is to the modern-day reader. Let's look at how Bob Cratchit is first introduced in Stave 1. You may notice that in this paragraph, and even in this entire stave, he is not actually named and is simply referred to as the clerk. Not giving Bob a name dehumanizes him and shows us how the upper class, Scrooge included, viewed the poorer working class at that time. In Victorian England, it was almost unheard of for the working class to be the subject of novels. They were usually just in the background as two-dimensional filler characters, simply there to serve the interests of the rich. However, although we do not even know his name, the description of Bob's one coal fire and the image of him trying to warm himself with a candle are so ridiculously pitiful that we cannot help but empathize with him immediately and think of Scrooge as a terrible employer. Another interesting thing to note is that he has almost no dialogue in this entire scene, despite the fact that he is present for all of it. Dickens tells the reader what the clerk says, but Bob does not have any direct quotations apart from this one. "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose?" said Scrooge. "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. What this shows is that Bob doesn't really have a voice in this relationship, or indeed at all in society. The one direct quote he has is immediately turned against him by Scrooge, as he doesn't really care to hear his answer. He is clearly terrified of his employer, and for good reason, as he is pretty much at the mercy of his whims. This might make him seem like a meek and cowardly character at first, but it is really just to ensure his survival. If Bob dares to ask for more coal, Scrooge will fire him. If he makes any attempt to oppose Scrooge's ideas, he is threatened with losing his situation. The poorer working class in Victorian England were not protected by workers' rights or unions, as labour reform laws were still in their early stages, and at this point were more about benefiting child labourers. The average working class person could be fired, underpaid, made to work in subhuman conditions, and nobody would intervene. The importance of being a good employer is therefore something that Dickens really stresses in this novella through the character of Bob, which is why he reveals his salary early on. "There's another fellow," muttered Scrooge, who overheard him. "My clerk with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam." There are lots of references to money and salary whenever Bob is mentioned in the story, and even his name is slang for shilling. This is not a coincidence, as Dickens draws attention to this pun in one of the first times that Bob's name is written. Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name. From Scrooge's comment about retiring to Bedlam and the repetition of but 15 in these extracts, it is clear even to a modern-day reader that 15 shillings is not enough to comfortably support Bob and his family. Scrooge even goes so far as to imply that Bob is practically insane for thinking he can enjoy Christmas with that measly amount. However, this salary was actually pretty standard for Victorian times, so Dickens purposely repeats that sum of money so that the readers can compare what they or others earn to what Bob earns, and realize that as awful as Scrooge is, he is actually paying him what most other employers paid their working class employees. As there were no labor regulations in place, people could get away with paying their employees much less than they should, because they knew that their only other option would be the workhouse. Bob really needs that 15 shillings to continue to feed his large family and take care of his dying son, so he must put up with Scrooge's behavior quietly and meekly, because the alternative is far worse. Now, from what we've seen so far, it's fair to say that Bob's work situation is pretty bleak. He has a miserly, grouchy employer and a really dull job as a clerk in freezing, unsuitable conditions. This would put a damper on anyone's Christmas spirit, but we soon find out that Bob is not just anyone. As soon as he leaves Scrooge's office, his real character comes out, which is quite a contrast to how he behaves at work. The clerk went down a slide on Cornhill at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honor of its being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play a blind man's buff. In this paragraph, there is no hint of the meek, quiet clerk persona that Bob puts on at work. Instead, he is bursting with energy, going down the slide a ridiculous 20 times, and dashing home to play even more games with his children. The contrast of this scene after Scrooge's dismal old office and extreme anti-Christmas sentiments really helps the reader to connect with Bob even more, as he is not beat down by his unfortunate situation, and is still determined to enjoy Christmas with his family to the best of his ability. We get to see more of the Christmas-loving, energetic Bob in the third stave, when Scrooge visits the Cratchits' house with the ghost of Christmas Present. He seems to be the ideal family man, playing the role of father and husband to perfection. Scrooge and many others from the upper or middle class who had no connection to the poor and how they lived had the misconception that money was equivalent to happiness, and that you wouldn't be able to enjoy Christmas if you were struggling financially. So that is why the scene at the Cratchits' house was so important for Dickens to include, because it disproves that idea and shows that Bob's source of happiness is from family, not from money. In fact, the only time Bob's Christmas spirit is even slightly dampened is when he is led to believe that one of his daughters will not be visiting. Bob really cares about each one of his children, and he has a lot. This provides a sharp contrast to Scrooge's experience of fatherhood, as his father was cold and distant, while Scrooge himself gave up the chance to be a father when he chose money over his fiancée. In Victorian times, men were considered to be the head of the household, so Bob's behavior as a father and husband really spearheads the way that the rest of the family behaves. His enthusiasm rallies all of them and ensures that their experience of Christmas is just as enjoyable as if they were rich. The use of hyperbole and repetition in this description definitely provides some comic relief because it draws attention to the image of this enormous family treating a very modest dinner like it is an absolute banquet. This allows the reader to connect with and sympathize with the Cratchits, particularly because they are so determined to be content and not mention their poverty or the small quantity of food that they have. Nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. Clearly their family has a lot of pride and are not prone to complaining despite their lack of money. To Scrooge and the average Victorian reader who was not in touch with the working class lifestyle, this would have provided a much different view of the poor than the assumptions they were used to. It might be expected that Bob would be the penny pincher at Christmas rather than Scrooge, but his surprising generosity and uncomplaining attitude are much easier for readers to relate to and support. If you found this video helpful so far, please give it a like, it really helps out the channel. Bob's generosity of spirit extends to Scrooge too, as he calls him the founder of the feast at dinner, which is far more than he deserves, as Mrs. Cratchit points out. Mrs. Cratchit's outburst is the only sign of complaint that we see the whole evening, and to be honest, it is kind of warranted given their situation. However, Bob simply responds with, "The children! Christmas Day!" This brief interaction is important for several reasons. His wife's remark brings the reader back to reality and reminds us that although this family really tries to make the most of what they have, they are still desperately poor. It's easy to think of Bob as just a silly, sentimental man, but his exclamation of, "the children," is very telling as it reveals that he is acutely aware of the difficulties they are facing. For the sake of the children, however, he chooses to set a good example for them by being cheerful and not complaining, as he knows he has to hold his family together during these tough times and ensure they have the best Christmas and childhood possible. Additionally, Bob's mention of Christmas Day reflects the Christian attitude of forgiveness on this holiday in particular, which would have been admired by Victorian readers who generally viewed the working class as uncouth. Bob's religious ideals are also mentioned earlier on when he returns home with Tiny Tim. In Dickens' time, Christianity was the prevalent religion, and so Bob's religious faith would have truly exemplified him as the ideal working-class man to the readers. The tremble in Bob's voice, however, betrays the fact that despite his faith, he is afraid for Tiny Tim's future. Later in the evening, there's another instance like this, which shows that Bob knows the seriousness of his son's situation, and that this is probably the last Christmas he will ever have. These solemn moments are interjected in the otherwise bubbly and cheerful scene to remind the readers of the stark reality of the Cratchits' poverty, and to show Scrooge that his poor treatment of Bob has real and fatal consequences that he had not considered or cared about previously, as he had no connection with the poorer class. His whole life and his children's lives are completely dependent on the decision of his employer, which is why it is so important that Scrooge is touched by the plight of Tiny Tim. It is this realization that really drives Scrooge's transformation from here on out, as he is determined to let Tiny Tim experience the kind of fatherly love from Bob that he never had. This sentiment is really driven home in the fourth stave, when Scrooge revisits the Cratchits' house with the ghost of Christmas yet to come. In this scenario, Tiny Tim has died, and there is a stark contrast between the fast-paced, joyful atmosphere of the previous Christmas and the more somber, quiet atmosphere of this one. Bob does his best once again to put on a brave face for his family, speaking to them cheerfully and lovingly, but he cannot help but let out some emotion now and then. The repetition of little when Bob refers to Tiny Tim shows how deeply affected he is by losing him at such a young age, and draws attention to how fragile he was. It also highlights the deaths of the thousands of other young children in England at that time, who were forced to live and work in awful conditions, with rampant illnesses and extreme deprivation. Dickens was profoundly moved by the plight of these children, and that is why in many of his novels he includes the character of a small, innocent child that has been wronged by the system. Tiny Tim is one of these characters, and he is there to illustrate the consequences of the class divides that existed in England. Many of these children's lives could have been spared if the upper or middle class employers simply raised the salaries of their employees so that they could better support their families. Despite this terrible tragedy that Bob has been through, he is still the same man that he was previously, the head of the household that does his best to hold his family together while they grieve. This contrasts what happened in Scrooge's life after the death of his mother. Scrooge's father sent him away to boarding school and did not let him return home even for the holidays for many years. This decision drove their family apart, whereas Bob uses Tiny Tim's death to bring his family together even closer. That takes incredible strength and proves that Bob is far more than a two-dimensional comedic or sympathetic character. As a poor man in a class-divided society, there is so much that he cannot control, but the one thing he can is his attitude towards the situation. In the final stave, Bob probably has the most extreme reaction towards Scrooge's transformation when he says, "And therefore I'm about to raise your salary." Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him, and calling to the people in the court for help and a straight waistcoat. It is much more plausible to Bob that Scrooge has simply lost his mind rather than offer to pay him more money, which reminds the reader that to those who did not witness his journey, Scrooge's redemption would be almost unbelievable. Importantly, Scrooge tells Bob right away that he is going to raise his salary and help his struggling family, which is a major moral of the story. Bob's development as a character is completely reliant on Scrooge's transformation, as his whole life is affected by how much he is paid. In a society where the upper and middle class held the power to drastically improve the lives of others, Dickens wants employers to see themselves in Scrooge and make an effort to pay their Bob Cratchits more money. Something else to note is that in direct contrast to the opening stave, Scrooge mentions Bob Cratchit's name 4 times in their final interaction, which implies to the reader that he is no longer just a nameless clerk to Scrooge, but a fully realized human being. If you're interested in getting an in-depth look at some of the other characters in A Christmas Carol, check out my character analysis of Fred here. So to summarize, Bob Cratchit's character in this novella gave Victorian readers a deeper look into an unfamiliar subject, as poor people were rarely given much depth of character in books at the time. he and his family provide a window into the struggles of the poorer working class to the upper and middle class readers who had no connection with them in real life. They are also portrayed in what would have been a surprising way, dignified, hard-working, full of joy, and with what was considered proper Christian ideals. Bob also teaches the readers the value of money. He reveals that money cannot buy things like happiness and fatherly love, but what it can do is represent the difference between life and death for the poor. While class divides may not be as apparent as they were in Victorian England, the lessons that Dickens teaches through Bob are still relevant today. His stoicism in hard times and determination to hold his family together rather than push them away is something that many of us can learn from or relate to. And even though the stakes may have been higher back then, employers in modern-day workplaces can still do more to help their employees and look after their well-being, and we can still be sympathetic and generous to those less fortunate than us. Thanks for watching, guys! Stay tuned for follow-up analysis videos soon to come. See you next time!